Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage!
Okay, well, here it is. I'm back. It's been a while. Just haven't felt like making not that I haven't felt like making a video, but I'm definitely suffering from lack of inspiration. And yet all my friends have been making videos, and I'm glad to see when they're up posting videos. It's like visiting their house, and it kind of makes me feel guilty that I haven't put anything up. So here I am back in the garage. You have no idea how long it took me to set this up. If you caught my video of me on the day of the eclipse, which was a few weeks ago now, I guess, in my living room, I had set up this computer that I'm recording on now, an old, almost 10-year-old computer that's dying. And as a matter of fact, it's so noisy that you might be able to hear it. It may come out in video. It's, I don't know, when I'm not doing anything on it at all, the hard drive starts spinning like, it can't keep up with all the things I'm doing on it, even though filming this video is literally the only thing that's going on right now. But it's an old computer that's dying. But oddly enough, it's the only one I have that I seem to be able to make videos on out here. I actually have two computers out here, but one of them I just can't. Something's wrong with the one that I have out here, which was a computer that it's rather old now, but I bought and I'm using specifically to record music. But I'm back in my garage, and so it's late September now. We had some weird weather back in the last couple of weeks of August. It got very fall-like, very autumn-like, which I dig. My favorite time of year is autumn. And it was quite unusual to have temperatures like, in the low 70s as a high, and in the 60s. And now that we're into late September, now it's in the 80s. And the forecast for the next 7 days is anywhere from like 80 degrees to almost 90. It's ridiculous. And I started getting the autumn vibe, and what happens, the summer comes in, I started getting the autumn vibe, and I'm kind of listening to music, or starting to listen to music that suits that time of year, as all of my listening, most of my listening is very seasonally oriented. And there's a lot of music and bands and groups and musicians that I listen to, say in the summertime, that rarely get played any other time of year. Not intentionally. I just don't, for some reason I just don't think of them, and I'm just not in the mood to hear their stuff. And then all of a sudden the summer comes around, and I'm back listening to the Yellow Jackets again for one. And certain Wes Montgomery albums. So I had this computer set up in my living room. If you saw my video of my live playing, which is almost an hour long, I had that set up, and all those instruments are still set up in my living room, taking up my entire living room. And I just dragged the computer out here and set it up, so I could film a video back in the garage while I can. Being that my place is so small, the garage has really become another home room for me here. As you might see, this is a slightly different angle, I think, than I've filmed before. So hopefully, if you watch these garage videos, you might get a feel. Hopefully, you get a feel for the size and space of the room, because I'm doing this at different angles. Now I have the camera against the wall. There's a wall right in front of me right here. So there's not much more space than what you see. You can see the walls on the side. Well, you can see the wall on that side. There's the one wall there. It's only one car garage. Can't really see the other wall here so much because, I've got shelving here. The shelf which is where the computer is actually. And instruments and storage and boxes going all the way up to the ceiling. And a printer and all that kind of good stuff. And the shelving goes all the way down to to the garage door back there. You can see the garage door. Move my hand. See the garage door back there, and there's a shelf immediately behind me, which I think you've seen before because that's where I pull my albums from. So I've been sadly uninspired lately, and yet I've been listening to a lot of music, and there's so much that I've been listening to, and old things that I've been going through and listening to again. And I had stacks and stacks and stacks of them to talk about and make a video about, and it just got overwhelming. There's so much stuff, I can't catch up now, so I'm just going to have to skip over a lot of my summer listening. And maybe focus on what I've been listening to lately, things I've been buying. As you probably know, I've been unemployed for over a year now, since my last job. And I shouldn't be buying CDs, but I just went on I'm bad. I don't have the money to spend, but I've been on a buying spree. A lot of them I got good deals on, because I'm shopping all around looking for the cheapest price and everything, but I still shouldn't be buying them. But since I am, I'm going to show them to you. And a few things of what I've been listening to. Now, I guess since I did my last video, John Abercrombie passed away. And I have this thing, and I've mentioned it, that any artist that I'm seriously heavily into, like a John Abercrombie, and I get into while they're still alive, when they pass away, it's really hard for me to listen to their music for a long, long time. And with John Abercrombie, I discovered his music probably around 1978, and I've been buying his albums ever since. I don't know if a month goes by where I don't listen to something of his. And so I was absolutely in shock when he passed away. And I feel very close to him in a lot of ways because, I have other favorites like Eberhard Weber and people like that are basically, people I've been into for many years, and they're European, so, they're not guys from the States. So, in the case of somebody like a John Abercrombie, well, John Abercrombie lived most of his life very close to where I am, just over the borderline. I'm right kind of on the New York State borderline here, and he lived not far from here for quite a long time. He had lived in New York City, I think, in the late 70s, early 80s, but moved out to the suburbs of New York State. Probably by the early 80s, when a lot of jazz musicians seemed to move out of New York City at that time for various reasons. A lot of them went to the West Coast. I think a lot of them went because of the expense of living in the city. And, people like Jack DeJohnette have lived in Woodstock, New York area for a really, really long time. And it's close enough that you could drive to gigs in New York City, but you could drive home at the end of a gig, too. Abercrombie basically spent most of his life in New York, so he didn't really move very far from where he grew up at all. And he went to Boston, I know, to go to music school. But, he spent a few years out there in Boston when he was very young doing the music school thing, but then moved right back into New York area. So in a lot of ways, because he was basically almost a neighbor of mine, I felt particularly close to him. And yet, as shocked as I was and saddened by his passing, I did something that I very rarely do, and that's I found myself listening to a lot of his music. I didn't bring any of it here to show because I just kind of randomly were playing anything. And it's odd for me to do that when a musician passes away that I've been into during his lifetime. Which brings me to a point I'll do a whole video on. When I got into jazz in the late 70s, I think everything that I picked up, regardless of whether it was like an ECM type artist or mainstream artist, I think the only guy that wasn't alive at that point was Wes Montgomery and some of the guys that backed up Wes Montgomery, like Paul Chambers and Philly Joe Jones. Was it Philly Joe? No, Philly Joe Jones was still alive. But there's a couple guys that backed up that were part of Miles Davis's group that backed up Wes Montgomery as well. And I think Wes Montgomery and a couple of his backing musicians there were the only guys that weren't alive at that point. I mean, Thelonious Monk was still alive when I was into jazz, and that seems like he died a very long time ago. So anyway, it was quite odd that I found myself listening to quite a lot of John Abercrombie, and you know, it's definitely a sad thing. I have to apologize for the lighting. There's nothing I can do about the lighting in here. There's a single bulb just above where you can see the video, the roof, and that's all the lighting I have in here. I could bring in a floor lamp. You know, there's literally one outlet in here, and I've got probably 75 things plugged into that outlet. I have I have extension plugged into extension plugged into extension times 8, all into one outlet in here. So it's a wonder that anything works. So you know, I guess I could bring my lamp in here, but that might be the thing that blows the whole circuit. Who knows? So yeah, I did a lot of listening to John Abercrombie. This is going to be a rambling video in case you didn't know. And you know, I was just testing it. I always do a little test video before I start filming, and just for a few seconds to make sure the microphone's on and everything. And every other test video I tried, which each one was only a few seconds long, didn't come out. So I don't know until I'm done recording whether or not this is recording and whether it's going to be a video or whether I'm going to talk here forever and nothing comes out. Steely Dan. I don't talk too much about pop groups. I was never heavily into Steely Dan, but Walter Becker died, one of the two guys that really were Steely Dan, which basically two guys that were songwriters that used a lot of session musicians and a lot of jazz session musicians that us jazz heads would know, guys like Don Grolnick, Steve Kahn, Dean Parks, Larry Carlton was a big part of their later albums, and I was never a fan of them. I thought their albums were too dry sounding, and yet they were always lauded for having a great sound on their albums and for being, you know, very carefully engineered. You know what? Listening to them now, I get it. I get why they did what they did. I still think some of those later albums like Gaucho are too dry sounding for my taste, especially the drums. But when you think that, you know, most of their classic recordings were recorded in the 70s, 72 to 80, they really sound pretty damn good today. And they have aged well, I will say. You're going to hear some extraneous noise, like I mentioned, from my computers, and there's some computer speakers that are popping and grinding away. So, you know, you're probably going to get some miscellaneous noise on here. So, I had one and only one vinyl by Steely Dan, the Gaucho, which I don't know why I bought it. I didn't hear the album before I bought it, and I didn't like it very much. But years ago, this is why I stayed a member of those RCA and BMG and Columbia record clubs. I got a really good deal on this box set, which was all of their albums from their initial period when they broke up in 1980 or 81. They had recorded albums between 72 and 1980. They recorded 7 studio albums. And that box set, this box set came out of their studio albums. And Walter Becker passed away, and it made me really for the first time pull this out. Now, I had in this old computer, I actually had copied all of the CDs from this set in there, but I don't think I ever listened to them beyond the first album. And this is why I like to keep receipts. I bought this from the BMG Jazz Club. Invoice date September 25th, so it's almost the anniversary of it, 2003. And despite the fact that they charged almost $9 for shipping for this box set, which is ridiculous. This CD box set was basically half price at $23.99, but that doesn't count the almost $9 for shipping. But I wouldn't have bought it at full price. The full price is, well, at this time it was half, so the full price was almost like $48 or so back when it first came out. But I got a good, but this was, what I thought was a good deal. I bought it. I don't think I listened to it. Apart from the first album, which I, only knew a couple singles from. And I had heard most of the Asia album on the radio, which isn't my favorite album of theirs. Oddly enough, the earlier you go with them, the more I like their stuff. Out of their first classic 7 albums, they recorded 7 albums between 72 and 80. Most people like their last 2, Asia and Gaucho, but I think they don't do it for me. The title track on Asia is a really good song, and they were still stretching at that point, but most of the rest of that album doesn't hold up for me. The first 5 albums were really good, and even though most of the jazz players that they used in the studio came on the last 2 albums, I don't think it's what they did best. The first 5 albums, I wouldn't say they were more rock, but they were a little less, maybe a little less smoothly structured jazz. And the jazz influence was still there, but the melodic content of those first 5 albums of theirs, which I'm really hearing for the first time apart from some of the singles, I'm really liking. I never cared for their lyrics very much. It seemed to me that, the one thing I appreciated about the lyrics was it wasn't the standard kind of predictable things that they were singing about. But it seemed to me that nearly all their lyrics were put-down lyrics. It seems like they were just putting down one group of people after the other. And I don't know which guy is responsible for that. I don't necessarily know that Donald Fagen wrote all of the lyrics and Walter Becker didn't. I think they probably both wrote the lyrics and the musical structure, the chord changes as well. But listening to it now, I think I'm a little less harsh about the lyrics, maybe. I'm still getting a lot of that. It seems like there's a lot of putting down one person and one group after the other in their lyrics. But I could be wrong. I don't focus a whole hell of a lot on lyrics. But I really like a lot of the melodies and instrumentation of the first albums. There's times when I can even pick out like Larry Carlton playing, because I know a lot of these guys from jazz. I think Wayne Shorter shows up. I think Wayne Shorter plays on Asia, if I'm not mistaken. So I found myself enjoying them a lot and not being so emotionally attached to the fact that Walter Becker passed away, because I was not a hardcore fan, though. He seemed like a decent guy. And he was 10 years older than me. He was 67. So, that hurts. But I always go on in my videos about the age of a lot of musicians that I listen to, and just recently, again, I was looking up musicians that I'm not hardcore fans of, so I don't know a lot of their history, but I do listen to, and I'm finding a lot of guys that died at my age and even like 6 or 7 years younger than me to my age now, and I'm like, damn, it's scary. So yeah, I'm not going to talk much about pop music, but I was surprised at how much I like these Steely Dan things, and most of the songs I had not really heard before, apart from the singles. I think I'm a little nostalgically attached to the group simply because their first album and their first singles hit AM radio at a time, pretty much the last year or so that I was listening to AM radio when I was about 13 years old. And their first album came out in 1972, and they had 2 really big singles off of it, both songs that I really loved at the time. Reeling in the Years was one of them, and Do It Again was the other. And they were big, big, big hit singles, and it was a new band, and it was their first album, and I was still about a year or so away from tuning into FM radio. So when something was a hit, I was still very much aware of it. And I liked them. right off the bat, I like those two songs. They were a new band then, so there's a nostalgic element to their music, as they're very much tied to my youth, and they pretty much came out with an album a year for their first 6 albums, and then had like a 3-year gap between their 6th and 7th album. But by the time they finished their 7th album, when they split up for over a dozen years, in 1980, I was out of high school. So their whole career kind of started for me when I was still in grade school, listening to AM radio. And then when I was in high school and I had switched to FM radio, they were still really big to be played on FM radio. Even if the stations I listened to didn't necessarily play the singles off of the albums, they were playing maybe deeper album tracks. So I would hear them, still throughout my high school years. And they didn't split up until 3 or 4 years after I graduated high school. And I was, at that point, not even listening to rock music anymore. But I was reading and kind of kept aware of what was going on with them, so I was a little surprised when they split up. But all bands do eventually. So I found myself listening to them. Really, I think I only pulled that out because of Walter Becker's passing, and really enjoying their stuff, and even seeing a couple of videos with them being interviewed, Donald Fagen and Walter Becker. Walter Becker definitely seemed to be the more personable of the two, approachable, easygoing. What does that have to do with anything? Absolutely nothing. So that's one of the things I was listening to, and then the other stuff that I've been listening to, which I'm going to show, a couple things were gifted to me. Robert Rich Live at the Gatherings, which Gatherings is a live concert series held in, I get the Philadelphia, I know it's Pennsylvania, I'm not sure if it's the Philadelphia area, I think it is. This is a 2 CD set. Robert Rich doesn't do a whole ton of live performances. He probably does a bit more now than in the past. I think there was a time in the past when, like, a lot of studio-bound electronic musicians don't necessarily do a lot of live playing. I think in recent years he has picked up again and started doing it. And if I'm not mistaken, I remember when this concert was put on, because I've been on the Gatherings mailing list that they had, and it seems like every year they do a series. It doesn't go on all year. It's only certain times of the year that they tend to do these. Chuck Van Zyl is the guy that runs the series. And this is real nice, and a lot of it's very surprising that it's live, because it sounds like more than one musician, but then again, a lot of stuff is sequenced. And Robert Rich is just a really intelligent guy. And if you're into electronic music, and quite again, another personable guy, you can see interviews with him up on YouTube, where he talks about his music, etc., etc. And he's very intelligent and well spoken, so he can speak about his music, and present it in a lot of knowledge and information behind it. And then there's another CD that was a present too, and I don't think the person necessarily wants me to mention them, by none other than Chuck Van Zyl, who's the guy that runs the Gathering concert series that Robert Rich CD is drawn from. And here's an album called Celestial Mechanics. It's come out a couple different times, from what I understand. Originally it came out and went out of print very quickly, and then Chuck himself recently reissued it, and this is a recent reissue, and I don't know why. It's a nice digipack. I don't know why he made it a limited edition when he put this album out. He made it a limited edition of 100 copies only, which is just not a whole hell of a lot. And I got number 99 out of 100. Isn't that something? And this is another enjoyable listen. Late night stuff. Actually, because it's a big deal to me, the time of day that I listen to music, even though I listen all day and all night, I kind of like to point out, when things might not be obvious, which things are really specifically late night listening. There's some things that are just too quiet and too, I don't want to say contemplative. I don't know if that's the right word. That are very hard to listen to during the day. Even though, I'm in my place and it's relatively quiet in here, but the sun may be streaming through a window, and there's just something about some music that doesn't match that scenario. Now, in the past, I'm jumping around a bit. Now, this is definitely stuff you listen to anytime. In the past, I've talked about my nostalgic love of the compact jazz series on Verve Records. In reality, there's nothing special about this series. This is a series of compilation CDs that Verve put out, and Verve is shameless in just putting out tons of probably they have more compilation CDs by an artist than the artist had original albums. But in the late 80s, between like 87 and 89, when compact discs were new, a lot of artists that are older and established, like Gene Krupa, who's known as a big band drummer probably of the 40s, I guess, or 50s and 60s, continued on. I think I want to say he passed away in the late 70s. Continued to play until then. But there was a lot of these older albums, because CDs were new, that hadn't been issued on CD yet. And oddly enough, all these years later, there's a lot of albums in their catalog that still haven't been reissued in full on CD. And because all the factories were churning out the new albums that these groups were putting out, and musicians, what they did at Verve and a lot of record labels that had a lot of artists with a lot of older material is they threw together compilation albums, just so there would be something of theirs, this artist's, on compact disc from their older material. And I recently picked up two. It's the first Gene Krupa thing I've ever had, and really, I've never had a Gene Krupa CD before, or album even, and I've known of him, but his music is, what he's best known for is really from an older generation, from the 40s and even the 50s, but even in the 50s it was like an older big band style. And I'm not heavily into big bands, with the exception of the United Jazz and Rock Ensemble, which I like because of the individual musicians involved, which is a newer thing that came along in the 70s. And I love drummer-led big bands because I love drum solos. And I think it's good to listen to big bands just like it's good to listen to orchestra music, because you get a higher level of appreciation for the instrumentation and things like arranging. And I'm very big on arranging, and arranging for strings and horns and things like that. And there's really, a lot of these songs are fast and they fly by you, but there's really a lot to listen to in terms of the instrumentation and music. So for some reason, I got into this through Buddy Rich. I got into some big bands, mainstream jazz big bands, if they're led by drummers. Now this Gene Krupa one, which is probably a good one for me to start with of his music, is not his 40s stuff, but it's stuff from, looks like it starts in 1953 and goes up to 58. So, for him that was later material, even though he lived to the 70s. And like I've always said about the compact jazz thing, somebody came up with an initial cover design, and every single one of the compact jazz discs kept up this cover design of kind of mixing old and new. I guess kind of showing you that the music was old in a new format, maybe. And that is, they had a lot of black and white photos, and then they would spruce it up with a couple objects, usually things referring to the time period. And the objects were often in color. So you see a picture there of Gene Krupa at his drum kit, and a couple like model airplanes. And a couple of these model airplanes are gold, and they're in color, and that makes things kind of pop a lot. And every one of the compact jazz series has that similar cover design. But here's another one I picked up that I don't know if I showed it when I picked it up a while ago. Art Blakey, which is, I've got some LPs on vinyl by him, but I think this is the first CD I picked up by him. Shame on me. But again, compact jazz, and there again you see this the black and white photo and the black and white images, and then things like a matchbox, playing cards, advertisements. The West Montgomery one is good too, and shows these little model cars from the late 1950s, early 1960s, and I just love how they make the cover pop by mixing those black and white images with these little tchotchke things, these little matchboxes and playing cards and kind of pop art from the era. And this is Blakey's stuff from the 1950s mostly, and I enjoy it. Again, it's big band jazz with drum solos. Most of this stuff, again, this is from, I'm looking at the dates here, goes up to 59, starts around 54 maybe? 54 goes all the way up to 1966. It's quite a selection there of stuff. Not a lot of long tracks, so there's not a lot of long drum solos. But, I'm into jazz, I'm into mainstream jazz, so, I had one old LP by him, so it's good to have something. And that's music that is not nighttime music, because of the up-tempo-ness and brightness of all of it, the Gene Krupa and the Art Blakey. That's stuff you can listen to during the day or night or whatever. Might as well do these guys next. Speaking of big bands and drummers, I recently discovered this, which I think is a new release by Buddy Rich. I don't get why I only listen to Buddy Rich when I'm unemployed, but I've been on such a Buddy Rich kick now for a couple of years, off and on. There's months go by sometimes when I don't listen to him, but then sure as anything, I'm back in the mode again. Here's an album here that came out years ago called Very Live at Buddy's Place, and Buddy's Place was a nightclub that Buddy Rich had for a couple years, back in around 1974. And there was a live album released from that some of the club dates that he did play there while he was residing and ran this club. And recently, the original album is still available, called Very Live at Buddy's Place, but then just recently this one came out called the Complete Edition. And they added a few tracks, actually the only other tracks that were recorded at the same time that they had access to. They tagged onto the original CD, which is only 3 tunes, but it's, I don't know, another 15 minutes maybe. But the other, it's like 7 tracks or so that was on the original album. I didn't know this at the time. They were edited on the original release. It's a little weird because it's like, how the hell do you edit a live performance? I mean, this is not real modern technology. They recorded it, I'm sure, on a multi-track recorder, but these are live recordings done in Buddy Rich's nightclub with like I think an 8-piece band, 3, 4, 5, 6, yeah, like an 8-piece band. And yet when the original album came out, they edited. That's got to be hard as hell to edit these performances. They would like cut out a solo, etc., etc. Simply for the sake of time, because these were things that came out originally on vinyl LP, and they had a limited amount of space on each side. So they would cut out some solos in order to accommodate that. And that's got to be a very hard job to do. Well, here they restored it, so even amongst the original 7 tunes that were on the original album, they run much longer than the original album did. And so I've listened to the original album a whole lot, but I don't have it committed to memory where I could necessarily tell, oh, that solo wasn't there. But one of these days soon, I'm going to do a side-by-side comparison. But they restored all of these missing solos. And it's a good band he had at the time, with Kenny Barron on piano and Anthony Jackson on bass and Sonny Fortune on alto sax and flute, which may be some musicians that you may have heard of. And because I got this pretty cheap and it's gone out of print, I picked up this album called Wham, which was an album of his music recorded in 77. that didn't come out until about 2000, but then it came out and it went out of print fairly quickly. And I've been looking at this one for quite a while, and they're really getting high prices for it. I actually found a cheap new copy, and it's funny, I think I ordered it off of eBay. I'm always a little hesitant to order stuff off of eBay, but I've done a lot of ordering from them recently as far as music goes. And when I received the CD, I opened the package in the mail, and it was a different Buddy Rich CD, because I couldn't believe that I was going to finally get a hold of a new sealed copy of this at a reasonable price. When I opened the package up, it was a different Buddy Rich CD, and I'm like, oh no. You know, and I assumed that that the guy that was selling it mislisted the album, and he didn't actually have the sealed new copy of Wham. So I emailed the guy, and eventually he's like, oh yeah, it was the only other Buddy Rich album he was selling was the one that he accidentally sent me. And he said, I'll correct that. And he sent this one to me. And he said, keep the other one. But you know what? I already had the other one, so I just mailed it back to him. I didn't open it. I already had that album. I figured the guy was really reasonable in his price, so I mailed it back to him at my expense, sealed, the wrong one that he sent me. And, this way he can stay in business too. But this one, there's a famous Buddy Rich piece, a couple pieces that he played through a lot of his career that were extended pieces. One was, the name of it's escaping me. It's a movie. Wow, I'm getting senile. It's not listed here. Well, there was two extended tracks that Buddy Rich played, I guess going from the late 60s onward. One of them is called the Channel 1 Suite. And Channel 1 Suite pretty much always had a drum solo in it. And went anywhere from, I don't know, like maybe 9 or 10 minutes to 26 minutes. This is the longest version that was ever recorded of the Channel 1 Suite was on here. And it's about 26 minutes long. And that's the longest track probably he ever played live, I think. And it starts off with a drum solo, and then on brushes, which is real interesting to hear, and then the full band comes in, and then later on there's another drum solo during the course of the piece. So 26 minutes, so I just had to hear it. It's a great piece of music that I believe was written for him by Bill Reddy, which is one of the longtime members of his band. But and there's a lot of versions on Buddy Rich albums of the Channel 1 Suite, but this one was the longest known version. So for that alone, I wanted to hear it. Plus, there's a couple other tracks on here that I love that are tracks that Buddy Rich recorded a whole bunch of times in his career. One called Willow Crest, which is a lovely track. And another one that was actually composed by Bob Mintzer, the saxophone player, who a lot of people would probably know. He's in the Yellow Jackets, but he has a rollicking and rolling solo career as well. There's a track that he wrote called Tales of Rhoda Rat, which is a great little track. I'm pretty sure Bob Mintzer in his very young days played in Buddy Rich's band. So that's all daytime music stuff. That's stuff that you can listen to during the day because it's up-tempo and it's bright and it's happy. And here's one. Well, this one isn't exactly nighttime music. Here's one I bought off of eBay, and this is one of the reasons why I kind of question eBay. I know that there's a lot of, not just bootlegs, but there's legitimate albums out there that are counterfeit. And when I see something like that, and I guess somebody else that may have this album has to tell me if their copy is messed up like this. So I got this really cheap, new and sealed, supposedly, Jean-Michel Jarre's Electronica. I have a few of his albums. I think one of them is from the 70s, one is from the 80s, both of which were pretty good. The 80s one was done in the more 70s style because I know he got kind of modern and a lot of people didn't like. I didn't like what I heard from the samples either of a lot of his modern music. The reason I picked this one up, this is an all collaboration album, and I'm generally not into those because they don't flow. Even though all of the tracks were newly written, the music in the album itself tends not to flow. Not just in this case, but in a lot of cases of these collaborative albums, just because there's so many different artists involved, and each track is kind of its own entity, and they're not necessarily composed with an eye toward this, having this listening experience from beginning to end. Like you were listening to a single piece, just different sections of it. Well, this indeed doesn't flow, and this is not a very good album. This is by far the worst thing I've ever heard by him. But I only really wanted it because it's his collaboration with Edgar Foressa and Tangerine Dream is on here. And it's only one track, and it's about 6 minutes long. It's a so-so track. It's something that Edgar Foressa could have done on his own, or anybody that's in Tangerine Dream could have done on their own. Or Jean-Michel Jarre could have done on his own. There's nothing unique on there. In a 6-minute format, there's not much you could do in terms of, a real collaboration between these two guys should have been like a 20-minute or so piece, where they could really bring out different things. But it comes off as just a pretty average electronic song, and if you told me it was Edgar on his own, fooling around the studio, done in a day, I could believe it. It sounds like a lot of just kind of like random. It could be an Edgar Foressa track from any one of his kind of compilations, or whatever series he's doing, where he throws a couple new tracks on with a bunch of things that are already released. Not a great piece, but I'm glad to have it. I got it cheap. The other things on here range from just okay at best to absolutely horrible. I'm not going to get, as a whole, this album is not going to get a lot of plays from me. The thing that makes me think, I don't know if they designed it like this or it's counterfeit. The thing that made me think this is counterfeit, you see, most CDs open, but this one opens the rest of it. So this is not the back cover as much as if you hold it the correct way, it's upside down. So here is typically the way a CD would open. This is all printed upside down. Or, if it's printed the correct way, it opens from the opposite side. It doesn't seem correct. Did they intentionally do this? Or is this a counterfeit? So it's kind of messed up. So here, when you see the spine, here is typically the way you would normally hold and open a CD, but it's upside down. Messed up. Here's another one, and I just found out a lot of albums that I get are out of print before I even find out they exist. And here's another one from Narada, the great Narada label, which didn't last too long. Did they last into the? I want to say they did last into the 90s, but the early 90s, and then they died away. And in the early 90s, they were doing a lot of multi-artist compilation CDs. And this one, maybe I knew it existed, called Guitar Works, because they did quite a few CDs of guitar works done by multiple artists. So if I knew about it, I didn't really look into it so much. And I got this still sealed when I discovered that there's a Ralph Ellenberger, the German guitarist who I like a lot. There's a piece on here and two pieces by Martin Colby, they play together a lot in duets, but these are individual solo pieces. Two Martin Colby pieces, and I believe all three of these pieces are unique to this album. So I don't think they're pulled off of other albums, or else I wouldn't have bought it. I actually don't, I'm sure I did my research, and I don't recall now. If I would have found out that these were just tracks pulled off of their albums, I wouldn't have picked it up. So I basically picked it up for the two new, or otherwise unavailable, Martin Colby pieces, the Ralph Ellenberger piece, and then there's other people that Matthew Montfort from Ancient Future does a piece on here. John Doan, who's the guy with that harp guitar. A whole bunch of people I've heard of that I don't necessarily have a lot of things by. Eric Tingstad, which I do have a couple things by, does pieces on here. William Elwood and Sheldon Mirowitz, who I don't think I have anything by. Nando Loria as well. So very mellow, very, it's acoustic guitar oriented. But this is one that a lot of people can like and appreciate. It's not difficult. It's not really jazz. It's good music, but it's nice, kind of mellow, pretty stuff. It could be background stuff, for people that aren't necessarily into listening to seriously mellow stuff very intensely. So now I also, the highlight of this video, and the reason you're all watching it now, as you probably know, is my thing of taking a random pull of an old vinyl from my shelf, totally unknown to me which album I'm pulling out, and talking about whatever I can recall about that old vinyl album. And last time around, the album that I pulled out was Keith Jarrett's Clavichord album. Now, I knew that this album was back there because I'm often pulling albums out of my storage bins and putting them on the shelf and then putting others back in the storage bin, so that the shelf over the last, say, 6 months or so has gotten a different supply of albums put on it. But the thing that surprised me is that when this album came out in '87, I was already into CDs, and it came out on CD, and I don't know why I didn't buy it on CD, because I was already firmly committed to the compact disc world at that time. And the only reason I could think of is being a double disc set was really expensive, so I think that's the reason why I opted for the vinyl. Kind of sorry I did, because it's very quiet music. It's 2 clavichords, which is an instrument that you would have to look up because I can't explain how it sounds. It's very thin, very ancient, very old classical sound, like classical musicians use this keyboard. But it's in terms of volume, it's a very low-key, very quiet in volume instrument. And Jarrett recorded, I don't know how much of this he wrote. There's 2 albums worth here. I think about an hour and 40 to an hour and 50 minutes. A lot of it is improvised, and maybe some of it is written out in advance. But Jarrett's got 2 clavichords. So he's playing one with one hand and one with the other hand. Kind of interesting. And not that you notice a sonic difference between the two, but it makes, I think, for a more interesting listening experience, because that's the only instrument on here. There's no other musicians, no other instruments. It's just all this clavichord. And if you don't know what it sounds like, you'd have to just go look up clavichord, I guess, on YouTube, and you'll hear what it sounds like. It was recorded in July 1986. Well, I knew this album was in the stack. I hadn't listened to it for years. And simply because I pulled it out on my last video, I suddenly got the desire to hear it again. But my turntable's all messed up. Half the time, one of the channels just cuts out completely. And it's like, damn, I really want that on CD. So I go to look for it on CD to see how much they're getting for it nowadays. And I see that it's been out of print for years. And I'm like, why didn't I just buy the damn CD when it came out? By '87, I was buying all CDs. Why did I buy the vinyl album? Ridiculous. They're getting $119 for a used copy on CD. And I'm like, that's crazy. And it just upset me so much. And it's one of those rare instances, I guess, well, ECM has put the album out of print. Well, they got a bunch of albums out of print now. And the only reason ECM lets albums go out of print is because they're not selling well. So I went on this crusade to find it on CD at a decent price. I hate buying used CDs, but I mean, I was at $119 for a used copy. I think there was a new copy for like $145 plus shipping from somewhere. After looking weeks for it, I can't believe I found a used CD copy. Excellent condition. I gotta say, excellent condition. For less than $20. And I was amazed because I'm sure a new copy was more than $20, definitely when it came out. I couldn't believe it. I think it was like $14 in shipping, if I'm not mistaken. The booklet's in excellent condition. The CDs themselves are in excellent condition. And I always dump these right into my computer anyway, and I listen to them from my computer. But man, I was amazed. I had to jump on this. And now, you know, and this is all as a result of me just randomly pulling the vinyl out. I knew the album was there, but even though I knew the album was back in the vinyl stack there, I didn't give it enough serious thought prior to pulling it out on that video that made me want to really hear it. And then when I pulled it out and I you know, started thinking about it, it's like, damn, I really want to hear that again. That got me on a whole thing because the music on that album is very, very low key and quiet. The instrument itself has such a low volume level, and it's an excellently recorded thing, but you can actually hear the percussive sound of Jarrett's fingers hitting the keyboard, you know, because that's how closely they had to mic the instrument to get the sound. It's a very low in volume thing, so you know you have to have a very quiet studio, an engineer who knows what he's doing in order to pick up the nuances of the instrument. I would say it's a hard haul for most folks to really listen to that for an hour and 50 minutes or so. Let me see. One CD is 47 minutes and 47 seconds, and the other one is 53 minutes and 21 seconds. So it's about an hour and 40 minutes, an hour and 41 minutes. But man, but nighttime listen, that is something that you just cannot listen to during the day. Well, I got it, dumped it in the computer, started listening to it, and just got in that total magical zone. Now, there's some things where he really goes off on a tangent, and he's kind of wild, and it's not all low-key stuff. But overall, with the instrumentation of there being only the two clavichords that he's playing live, and the quality of the music and the fact that a lot of it is very low-key and mellow, it's definitely a late-night listen. I got so in the zone that it started affecting my listening of other things. And I was listening to that like, now that I'm talking about it, I'm probably going to do it again tonight. I was like, 2 or 3, 4 in the morning. I've got, nothing. It's so quiet in the house, and I'm playing this 2-record clavichord set, And it struck me listening to it, what it sounded like a lot is, it sounds a lot like a nylon string classical guitar. Very much in that mode, that sound. And so whenever I think, that made me go to my old collection and pull out this, which I've shown, I'm sure, before. And this is an album I highly recommend if you like any classical guitar music at all. But solo classical guitar, there's no orchestra backing, a single solo classical guitar. It's by a guy Stefan Marchondia, who is a classical guitarist. And this is entirely the music of one composer who I was not familiar with at all, which is why I bought it. I prefer to hear, when I'm listening to like classical guitar or a lot of classical instrumentation, I like to hear music by composers I don't know. So I'm not following the melody saying, oh, that's an interesting take on how this Bach piece is arranged, or something that you know. And just fully get into the music itself, and you don't know where it's going. And you're not comparing this version of it that you're hearing to other versions of it that you're hearing. So Manuel Ponce, I think that's it, is the composer. And all the music on here is by Ponce. And it's a nice, about 70-minute album, just classical guitar. No orchestra, so it's different than a lot of classical guitar albums that have orchestra. This is a late night listen. And now the first thing that drew me to it is I love the cover. I love that cover. And that's the first thing that drew me to the album. I believe this is out of print, but there's copies of it around, and I've seen used copies for really cheap. But it's definitely a late night listen. And as a result of that Keith Jarrett album, The Book of Ways, the clavichord, and the clavichord reminding me of the classical guitar sound, I immediately thought of this CD, and I'm like, wow, yeah. So I started playing this again. This I've had for a number of years, and it was recorded. It's not an old album. It was recorded in the late '90s, or early 2000s. I think it was recorded. I don't know. It's very late '90s, maybe very early 2000. But I think it was probably recorded in '98, '99 or so. So the recording quality is pretty high on there. And another one that I think I've talked about endlessly that I love, but another strictly late night album that there's almost nothing else like it. There's a few albums of music of ancient Greece, but this is the best one I've ever heard. But it's music that you have to listen to at 2 or 3 in the morning, or if you're driving in your car and you're all alone at after midnight or something like that. And this is just about, when I think of late night music albums, this is almost the first one that comes to mind. This is still in print, I believe. This ensemble, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, Organographia, which sounds like this orchestra, is actually all of three people. And a husband and wife team is one of them. And it's only 3 people, and listening to the music, you wouldn't necessarily think that. It's very low-key, very interesting stuff. But it is played entirely on instruments from ancient Greece. Now that they don't really have the instruments, these guys built the instruments themselves from the available materials they could get on what went into these instruments and how they were tuned and what they were like. So they actually built these instruments, or most of them, if not all of them, to create this music. So you see quite a few stringed instruments, but very, very, very light. Very almost like similar to a Chinese or Japanese stringed instruments that have a very limited range, very soft and light. Nothing deep like a full-size harp or even like a classical guitar or something like that. This is a beautiful album. I don't know how alien it would sound to a lot of people. And there's quite a few albums of music of ancient Greece that has a lot of vocalization on it. I'm a little bit less into the vocalization because when they use it, it seems like on other albums, it seems like it's a bit too loud in the mix or too oriented toward sticking the vocals on top of all the instrumentation. There's some voice on here done by one or more of the 3 members, but it's much more subdued and there's much less of it than on the other albums I've heard of this type of music. This is just fantastic. And these guys have done a few CD albums. This one's from 1997. They've done a few albums of music from ancient cultures, not just Greek. I've got to pick those up, but I don't know if they would ever exceed this one. This one is so fantastic. But boy, is that a late night. It's so quiet, and sometimes there's even moments when there's nothing going on. They'll pluck an instrument and the sound will decay in the air, and you don't hear anything for another 7, 8, 9, 10 seconds, and something else comes in, and some flute-like instrument or something. Absolutely stunning. Would really make great soundtrack music, and probably, I guess, if you watch travel shows or movies that were, trying to call up that vibe of the ancient cultures, of Greece, that this would be the perfect background music for it, because it definitely sets a mood. But that is one of, I would say this is definitely one of the most albums I would rate the highest. If I were to make a list of albums that I wish people would go out and buy and listen to and appreciate, this would definitely be way, way up there. Now, right now, it's ridiculous. It's in the 80s, and I've gone for over an hour. And back about a month ago, in August, when it's usually sweltering, we had this autumn-like weather, and I started getting my listening back into autumn-type stuff. And now that the summer's returned and it's in the 80s, and it's going to stay that way for at least a week, I don't know what the hell to do, because I'm not in the autumn mode. But I started realizing my very favorite time of year is Halloween time, and we're pretty much in it, because it's not just the day, it's the whole season. So I started exploring the things that I tend to pull out and listen to every year at Halloween. They're not necessarily music. And I had this famous Ghost Stories album that I bought in the 70s. Yeah, I bought this in the 70s, late 70s. But this is actually Ghost Stories. It was on the Pickwick label. I don't think Pickwick makes records anymore, or CDs. And I don't know how. See, Pickwick. Well, this has got a New York. I think Pickwick was Canadian company mainly, but they had offices all over the place. And this one's got a Woodbury, New York. Dana, I think that they used to have an office in New York State somewhere. I think Pickwick is gone now. Now, I don't play these actually on my turntable, but I was seeking these out on YouTube, and thankfully somebody has posted the entire album on YouTube. So I created a folder, and if I remember, I will put a link to the folder so you folks can listen to it as well, because I'm just a kid at heart. I love it. Here's another one that I bought back in the 70s, and this is basically it's two very long sides from the Lights Out radio program, which if you're really old you might have heard of. It's definitely before my time, but I had heard of it, as these albums are fairly popular in the late 60s, early 70s. A lot of these old radio shows started coming out on album. So Lights Out was a radio program, and here it is. And it's about a half hour on just one side. Now the second side, something called Four Fingers and a Thumb, which takes up most of the second side, which is another long thing. I thought it was another Lights Out program initially, but it's not. It's from a program from 1939 called The Witch's Tale. Well, so that was the name of the series, The Witch's Tale, which I was unfamiliar with. When I did research, I realized The Witch's Tale was a radio program that actually came out of New York City, of the very station that I listened to in my youth. When I was in high school and I was listening to rock music on the FM dial, I had a couple stations that I listened to, but I had also discovered on the AM dial a station called WOR, which still is in existence. But in the late 70s, WOR was the only station that was still doing these very old-fashioned type of shows. And if you know who Gene Shepard, the writer-humorist, is, he had a nightly show on there for an hour where he would just talk these funny stories, supposedly true, that obviously he made up. He was on. There were this comedy duo called Bob and Ray, which were absolutely hilarious, which were like I wouldn't say like an Abbott and Costello, because they played almost like an older version of Cheech and Chong. They played different characters, and they were on every day in the afternoon, and they were doing a skit-related show on radio live. These were live and new shows, and they were on 5 days a week. doing these new skits and playing these different characters in between commercials on an AM station. And I discovered, it was like, wow, this is like what it was like, what radio was like before television came along. And I loved that station. And they had Gene Shepard at night, and they had the Radio Mystery Theater, which was a syndicated show. So there's a possibility that a lot of people that are my age may have heard the Radio Mystery Theater, which was just a play. It was pre-recorded, but it was all new plays that were done. Nearly all of them were television celebrities that were then currently active in TV. And it was, it wasn't an ongoing thing. It was one story per show, a self-contained story, no ongoing characters or anything. And it was fantastic. And that was on, I think, like right after dinner. I want to say like after, probably like maybe 6 or 7 at night. And I got majorly hooked. And if I was a little older, just a little bit older, I would have had my own stereo system with a cassette deck, and I would have recorded a lot of these shows, but I didn't have that set up at that point yet. But I found out that this Witch's Tale was a radio program similar to Lights Out that ended in about 1939. That came out of that very same New York station, WOR. And I've had this album for, 40 years, and I didn't realize what the history of the Witch's Tale radio program was. For some reason, I thought it was just another show from the Lights Out series. I didn't realize it came from my neighboring radio station right over in New York City that I grew up listening to, and I'll still put on once in a while, but it's all political talk now, and very conservative political talk. So it's not something I'm going to listen to. But that station continued on. I would say the Radio Mystery Theater that I was talking about continued on to at least the early 1980s before they finally called it a day. And that stuff was on throughout the 70s, with Bob and Ray and the Radio Mystery Theater and Gene Shepard. That was all on through the late 70s into the early 80s. And it was like radio had been, 30, 40 years before. And I got totally enraptured, and I couldn't believe I've been listening to this all these years without realizing that the Witch's Tale, 4 Fingers and a Thumb, actually came right out of WOR, which I found online. I found that somebody had copied that story online on YouTube. So I created a folder. So I'm going to try to remember to put that in my folder as well. And so because this is going on really long, I'm still going to pull an album out, a random album, and talk about it. And now the spines of the album, just again, so you all know, are facing away from me. So I don't know what I'm going to pull. And I just hope that it's not a Britney Spears album or a Justin Bieber album or a Tiffany album or something like that. Totally at random, folks. Holy shit. These are in there pretty tight. Hold on a second. I'm having trouble pulling them out because they're in there so tight. Okay. Wow. Wow, this is one that's easy to talk about. Totally at random, folks. Even though you really can't see, I have them face, the spine is facing away. This is what I see. This is easy. This is almost too easy. David Darling's Cycles album on ECM. Of course I have this on CD. What can you say about it? David Darling has done a lot of solo cello albums, and I love them. But this one is, he's done albums with collaborations and albums and like duet with piano players, etc., etc. But this one is quite different for a lot of reasons. There's 5 other musicians that show up on here. I don't think the 5 other musicians ever play together on any individual track, which is actually to the benefit of the album, I think. I remember it's about a 45-minute album. And there's recorded in November 1981. I remember buying this. This is one of those I remember being in the store and picking up. And unfortunately, the shrink wrap ripped right where the price sticker was. And the price sticker usually told me what store it was in, but I think I remember what store I got it from. And it came out in '82, and it's a nice mixture of different flavors and different tracks and different combinations of the 5 musicians that play on here. This is oddly enough the first place I believe that I was aware of hearing the guitarist Oscar Castro Neves. But I think he played with Sergio Mendez's band, which is a all completely different world. You know, in that pop, you know, the instrumental, easy listening pop thing. But Oscar Castro Neves, I've seen his name pop up a few times since, and you know, I don't think I have anything else with him on it. So this turned me on to him. So I was heavily into ECM by this time. I had it all, and I was just buying the new stuff when it comes to ECM, just about. So at that point, it would be surprising back in '82 for me to pick up an ECM album that had a musician on it that I hadn't heard of before. Errol Anderson on bass, who did a lot of recording for ECM. Jan Garbrick, saxophones, who, you know, has been recording for ECM since the beginning. Steve Kuhn on piano, who's, you know, done his own multiple solo things over the years, you know, a bunch of albums for ECM. And Colin Walcott, the late Colin Walcott, from Oregon, playing sitar, tabla, and percussion. And this is a beautiful album. It's really unique amongst David Darling's discography because it's just because of the instrumentation and because the tunes aren't all composed. There's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 7 tracks on here, but 4 of the tracks are co-composed with whoever plays on that track. So there's 3 David Darling solo compositions, and then there's 4 tracks where I don't know if they were necessarily improvised. They probably were improvised because the credits seem to run almost exclusively to the people who play on that track. They get a co-composing credit. So Oscar Castro Neves gets a writing credit on 2 tracks. Steve Kuhn gets a writing credit on two tracks. Colin Walcott gets a writing credit on 3 tracks. Errol Anderson gets a credit on 1, and Jan Garber gets a credit on 1. Yeah, this is one that David Darling's recorded a lot of albums. Even I don't even have them all. I mean, he got into a thing in the 80s or 90s, even beyond ECM, where he was recording albums like they were dropping from the trees. So I didn't keep up with everything he's recorded, even though I have the ECM stuff, and I have a bunch of things he did outside of ECM stuff. I still don't have it all. But this is one that you have to have because it's just different. And it's different, good different. It's not different just for the sake of being different. It's a beautiful album, and a lot of it, again, is probably a bit more... There's only a couple things that are slightly have a tempo to them. This is, I think, more of a late night listen, even with Jan Garbrick's saxophone being a little overpowering at times. And yes, there's some percussion on here, courtesy of Colin Walcott, and he's playing tabla in some cases. So there's kind of a rhythm there. But it's still an album that I think is best listened to at night. And that's my random pick. This was easy. If my video had run shorter, I would do another album pick, because this was just too easy to talk about. I'm just waiting to pick out that, you know, that Britney Spears album that I'm going to have to talk about, or Duran Duran, or, you know, one of those embarrassing things that I have to try to explain my way out of. Okay, guys, I ran too long. Nobody is watching at this point. This is around a full CD length of an hour and 15 minutes. I'm sorry. But, I don't talk for ages, and then once I get wound up, I'm the Energizer Bunny. Hope everybody's doing well, and come back more frequently with shorter videos, I promise. Enjoy my garage. I've only got maybe another month or so to be out here before the weather gets too cold. See you soon, everybody.
Tales from the Garage is brought to you by Monster Out. Just spray it once a day throughout your home and keeps all monsters away, even invisible ones. Say goodbye to ghoulies, goblins, gremlins, mummies, vampires, and the living dead. Not effective on witches, chicken men, or rhino girls. And by Smoky brand cigarettes. 9 out of 10 doctors recommend smoky cigarettes to their patients. Remember, gals love a smoky man. Smoky, the key to great taste. Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.